Well, hello everybody. Here I am all by myself in my office, and I can tell you it's a little weird to do this, but unfortunately, I'm really sorry I cannot attend Psychonomics this year. Personal issues have made it impossible for me to take part, but I wanted to come up with this short presentation to express my appreciation of the influence that author's work has had on my own. And here's this picture of Arthur and Ryan, and when I visited them about 10 years ago in Point Roberts. Arthur, I hope you still look as good today as you did on that picture. Um, and so it all began, in a way, in 1967, that is 50 years ago, with the publication of this article by Arthur titled Implicit Learning of Artificial Grammars. That really was the beginning of the field of implicit learning. And, well, you know how this works. I don't have to go through the details of the experimental procedure again of this landmark experiment, but roughly, Arthur exposed participants to strings of meaningless letters generated based on a finite state grammar, which is depicted here, and showed that after exposing people to such grammatical strings for a while, they seemed to acquire the ability to distinguish between grammatical versus non grammatical strings in the absence of the ability to verbalize the rules of the grammar, which is what one means by implicit learning. It is sensitivity without awareness. There's a bunch of definitions of implicit learning. I'll stick to the first one by Arthur, the process by which knowledge about the rule complexities of the stimulus environment are acquired independently of conscious attempts to do so. And there's been many other people looking at this phenomenon over the next 50 years. And that research sort of raised the crucial issue of what we need to do in order to account for unconscious cognition. And not just implicit learning, but also germane phenomena, rule following without rule knowledge, correct action without understanding, of course, perception without awareness, implicit learning, but also the phenomena of implicit memory, memory without recollection. And all these phenomena point to a class of phenomena that Dan Dennett, in his latest book, From Bacteria to Back and Back, dubbed competence without comprehension. All these phenomena illustrate the fact that you can get competence without comprehension. You can have systems that are able to make decisions in the absence of knowledge about how they make such decisions. And as it turns out, back then, back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the dominant models of information processing, such as ACT-R and SOAR, of course, those models have now changed substantially in the way they work. But back then, the picture of information processing was really that of the von Neumann architecture, a traditional computer. There's inputs that gets processed by a central processor that interacts with a memory to produce a relevant output. And in that memory, one finds declarative statements or production rules. In either case, symbolic propositions that are sort of stored inertly in a database of knowledge. Now, I think this is particularly problematic insofar as understanding how competence can work without comprehension. And here is an argument that I developed about that. And it goes as follows. Awareness of some knowledge entails access to the relevant representations. If you take any sort of definition of consciousness, it always entails that one has access to the relevant representations. What it means for us to be conscious of something is that we can report that we have a particular experience, that we have made a particular distinction. Now, in classical models, representations always take the form of symbolic propositions. But in such systems, symbolic propositions cannot be causally efficacious unless they are accessed by the processor. These representations cannot do anything on their own unless they're accessed by the processor. And so therefore, in classical models, causally efficacious representations are necessarily conscious. And this makes it very hard to understand how unconscious cognition can work, because there is this triple bind between access, causal efficacy, and consciousness. So how can you accommodate the phenomena of implicit cognition, of implicit learning in such systems? There's basically three possibilities. One is to claim it does not exist. There's no unconscious cognition. Whatever you want to call cognitive is always accessible. Cognition is transparent to itself. This is what I've dubbed commando data theories by reference to the humanoid robot depicted in the Star Trek series, who seems to have perfect episodic knowledge of whatever it has experienced, who seems to have perfect introspective access to its own inner workings. This is a transparent agent that always seems to be able to justify its own behavior. And of course, today there's people who continue to defend this idea that whatever we want to call cognitive is necessarily associated with consciousness. I don't think it's very plausible to hold that position, but the methodological challenges associated with demonstrating unconscious cognition certainly give it some weight. The second possibility is to say that access can be unconscious. So now you break the link between access and consciousness. And that involves duplicating this entire machinery and claim that the very same operations can now take place without consciousness. So the unconscious system in those theories is viewed as being based on exactly the same mechanisms as those that are involved in conscious information processing, except it all takes place without consciousness. And this I call zombie theories because it sort of conjures the image that the unconscious is a zombie system in your brain that duplicates all the functions that are associated with consciousness, except without consciousness. I think it's obvious that this is also unsatisfactory for different reasons. The third possibility, though, is to let go of the idea that knowledge is necessarily propositional, that knowledge always consists of stored representations waiting to be accessed by the processor. And that was the great insight, I believe, of connectionism. That is, the demonstration that by removing ourselves from the idea that knowledge necessarily consists of stored propositional knowledge, and instead defending the idea that the very knowledge that drives the processing is embedded in the very structures that subtend that processing, we can get competence without comprehension. There's no access needed to the knowledge. The representations in connectionist systems as causally efficacious independently of being accessed by a processor. Those representations are active representations that can exert their effects on behavior in the absence of access. And I'm deliberately using here a picture of a connectionist network dating back from Rosenblatt's work on perceptrons, but the very same argument applies to today's connectionist systems, in particular the deep learning systems that are now able to be the best Go player without being able to understand its own knowledge. So this affords causal efficacy without access. This affords competence without comprehension. I think it is a great insight that makes it possible to understand how one can be sensitive to some relevant knowledge in the absence of the ability to access or explicitate that knowledge. And in my early work, I've used such connectionist systems to account for the phenomena of implicit learning, including artificial grammar learning, but also sequence learning. And as you may know, I've worked quite a bit with Elman's simple recurrent network. I won't go through how this model works. But when we look at what the system has learned after having been simply exposed to the regularities contained in sequences of items, such as the letters of the artificial grammar strings that author had used, well, one finds incredibly detailed, rich knowledge about the structure of this material. And so you can run simple analyses such as cluster analysis or principal components analysis in order to try to figure out how these systems represent the material that they have been exposed to. And in one such case, we found that the internal representations of that system were structured so as to reflect the structure of the grammar that the material that the network had been exposed to had been generated based on. And so, this was a truly intriguing result that demonstrates how such systems, merely by being exposed to exemplars from the relevant domain, can come to develop abstract knowledge about the underlying structure of this material in the absence of any sort of intent to acquire this structure, or in the absence of any mechanism that involves access. This is really learning as a sort of mandatory consequence of information processing. It is competence without comprehension. And so I think these systems have given us 4 insights about what goes on during information processing. The first idea is that of emergent representation. The idea that sensitivity to some regularity does not necessarily imply that the regularity itself is represented within the cognitive system as an object of representation. You can have and you can learn about lawful behavior without having a representation of the rules. You can get abstract knowledge out of the processing of exemplars. So that's a very first important insight, emergent representation. The second is functional specialization. We know that double dissociations do not necessarily imply architectural modularity. Instead, modules can be thought of as emerging out of the interactions of subsystems in such architectures. Modules, in that sense, are the product of learning rather than its starting point. And tasks in general are not process pure. And then we can get single system accounts of double dissociations, and the separable systems that we observe to be operating are now motivated by computational principles as opposed to being motivated by strong hardwired sort of distinctions. A third insight brought about by connectionist systems is graded processing. Many aspects of information processing involve graded and continuous dimensions rather than dichotomous relationships. So you can get stage-like development out of continuous changes. This leads us to think of abstraction as a graded continuum as opposed to a hardcore sort of distinction between exemplar-based knowledge and abstract knowledge. And it leads us to think that double dissociations can likewise exhibit this graded character. The fourth insight is mandatory plasticity. In all these systems, learning is a mandatory consequence of information processing. We learn all the time, whether we intend to or not, which is exactly what implicit learning is about. And there's considerable evidence for such plasticity. And one of the best behavioral demonstrations of this is, of course, the sort of experimental situation that author developed. Now, this is all good. We have these systems now that can successfully account for how learned knowledge can express itself onto behavior independently of access. We have this idea that these systems can acquire this rich, sophisticated, abstract knowledge about the stimulus environment to which it is exposed, in the absence of intentions to learn about this material, or in the absence of understanding of what it is that they have learned. But we have the competence, but where's the comprehension now? As Clark and Calmer-Smith pointed out, the knowledge that such first-order systems, we may call them, the knowledge that these systems acquired is forever embedded in the causal chain implemented by the network. And all the network can do is project this knowledge onto action. It's knowledge, as they put it, in the network versus knowledge for the network. The network doesn't know that it has acquired this knowledge, but of course conscious knowledge, well, that is knowledge that we know that we possess. It's a defining feature of conscious knowledge that we know that we possess such knowledge. And so the question now becomes not how you build a system that is capable of exhibiting sensitivity to some state of affairs or to the structure contained in relevant stimulus material, but to understand how such systems can learn to develop an understanding of what it is that they have learned. And I've been thinking about this for quite a while now, and a simple answer consists of saying, well, there's an observing system that is able to look at what the first-order system has learned in exactly the same way as we do when we look inside the hidden units of such networks and try to figure out how they have come to represent what it is that they have learned. And of course, that observing system can itself be a connectionist network, which would then be a meta-network, a network that is focused on trying to figure out what a first-order system has learned by observing its internal states. And such a system would then be able to produce type 2 responses, that is, to express, for instance, confidence about what it is that the first-order network has learned. Is it making the right decisions or not? That's exactly the sort of questions we can ask from human participants to figure out whether they know that they have made the decisions based on some explicit knowledge or whether they're merely responding based on intuition. And of course, you would want such responses to be influenced by language, by the social context in which this takes place, and in more general terms, by culture and by other people. Now, as it turns out, a prominent theory of consciousness works almost exactly along the same lines. This is David Rosenthal's high-order thought theory of consciousness, according to which a mental state is conscious if we are conscious of being in that mental state. We are conscious of being in a mental state, says Rosenthal, when we have a thought that we are in that mental state. In sum, a mental state is a conscious mental state in virtue of having a high-order thought that you yourself are in that mental state. Now, the one thing to understand about this perspective on consciousness is that those high-order thoughts, which I prefer to call meta-representations, do not themselves need to be conscious. They are unconscious mental states, but their existence indicates to the agent the existence of relevant first-order representations, and it makes the contents of those first-order representations available to form the contents of phenomenal experience. So for every conscious mental representation we enjoy, the idea is that there's an unconscious mental state, a meta-representation that indicates to you as an agent the existence of the target first-order representation. And we've tried to figure out how we can instantiate that idea using connectionist networks. And so, one simple idea is to just carry on with the intuition I described to you about the relationship between higher-order systems and first-order systems, and claim that, you can turn any first-order system on its side, so to speak, and have it be input to a representational redescription system that is going to try to figure out what that first-order system is actually doing. that's an implementation of Rosenthal's idea that consciousness comes about in virtue of the existence of meta-representational systems that carry out something akin to Annette Carmeloff-Smith's representational redescription. And so, on the horizontal axis, we have the brain learning about the world. This is about type 2 decisions, about whether you can decide whether a string is grammatical or not. And then you have this vertical learning, which is really about the brain learning about itself. It is signal detection on its own representations. It's trying to make useful distinctions in the representations acquired by the first order system, so as to come up with the possibility of doing type 2 kind of things, that is expressing confidence, qualifying those first order states in different ways. Is this a true representation? Is this an hallucination? Is this something that comes about because of the inputs of the first order system, or is this something that comes about because of another source of input, and so on and so forth? So, and that's, it's a very active domain now in many different domains, such as metacognition, but you can also make links with predictive processing in different ways, and you can also make links with cognitive development in different ways. And all these ideas converge to the core notion that the brain learns about its own activity by mechanisms of representational redescription, by having one part of the system look at another part of itself, so as to finally get back the comprehension bit into the competence without comprehension idea that Dennett put forward, and of which implicit learning is one of the best examples. So this research continues now, and I'd like to close by sort of pointing out to two lingering issues that are methodological in nature about this research, because as you know, this research remains controversial. We have to be very careful when we make inferences about the extent to which information processing can take place without awareness. And there's two main strategies that you can use in order to make content unconscious, make information processing unconscious. One is a different array of weakening methods by which you're trying to make the stimulus itself weak. Now, this is not what's going on in implicit learning, because the stimuli there are fully visible typically. But I'm thinking here more of cases like subliminal perception, where typically one would use masking of different kinds so as to weaken the stimulus. And all these methods are such that even when you pay attention, the stimulus remains invisible. And as it turns out, this is extremely difficult to achieve. All sorts of details matter. And in general, these methods raise what I've called the strength-efficacy dilemma. If you weaken the stimulus too much, then you lose causal efficacy. You have no effect, you have no priming, you have no learning. But if you let it be stronger, then you have awareness. And a continuing challenge then is to figure out how to land in that sort of Goldilocks zone between sufficient strength that you get behavioral effects and sufficient weakness, so to speak, that awareness cannot take place. This is an issue that comes up mostly in subliminal perception, but in different ways it also applies to the sort of research that Archer was interested in. The second strategy is misdirection. And here the general idea is to draw attention away from the critical stimulus. One thinks here of cases like inattentional blindness, change blindness, but also implicit learning. One may argue, for instance, that in artificial learning experiments, the stimulus set is so complex that the rules and the regularities that are relevant to driving behavior remain sort of shrouded under a veil of complexity. there's many items, there's many letters, the differences are subtle, and so on and so forth. I think here the difficulty is that we run, when it comes to assessing the extent to which people are aware of those regularities, one runs into the observer paradox, something that the philosophers have also called the refrigerator light problem. The more you probe awareness, the more you attract people's attention to the very thing they're supposed to remain unaware of. And so in implicit learning experiments, it's difficult to figure out how to properly probe people, because of course, as soon as you begin asking questions, did you notice anything? What was the basis for your decision? Then you engage the higher order systems that you specifically want to remain uninvolved in this particular case. So two continuing methodological issues that one needs to worry about in this research: the observer paradox, and then the strength-efficacy dilemma. But overall, I think that even though there is continuing debate about the extent to which consciousness is involved in such experiments, it's fair to say that, as author once put it, people's ability to learn about this material always seems to exceed people's ability to explain what it is that they have learned. And it is this gap that is interesting. Consciousness cannot be turned off, right? People are always going to try to figure out what's going on. But the interesting case is one in which people's ability to learn about the material seems to exceed people's ability to explain it. And a lot of learning seems to be taking just that form of learning without intention and without a full ability to explain what it is exactly that you've learned. So here's me again in Point Roberts in 2006 with Arthur. Arthur's work truly influenced my work in many different ways, and I'm very grateful to him for having launched this domain, which even today remains, after 50 years of work on these sorts of experimental situations, a totally fascinating sort of domain to work in. I keep being influenced in my own thinking by Arthur's writings and by this entire sort of empirical exploration that he launched 50 years ago. So there you go. Here's my lab, hard at work. We're all working on the differences between conscious and unconscious information processing, and a lot of that has to do with implicit learning. Thank you very much for listening to this. I hope it went through okay. As I said initially, it's a bit bizarre to do this all by myself in my office, but I very much hope you have a great symposium. And Arthur, I hope to see you very soon in Point Roberts or elsewhere in the world. Thank you.